this is TBD, and in this video I'm going to be talking you through the different sections of a basic employment contract between a club and a player. A contract is a written or a spoken agreement between two or more parties that is intended to be enforceable by law. I can hear some of you going spoken, and that's correct. A contract can be spoken. However, it's always best practice to have your contract in writing and signed. That way, if there's ever any dispute and you bear the burden of proof, you're able to say, this is what we agreed and this is what we signed. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on a written contract. I'm sure there are many of you watching this video now who are guilty of not thoroughly reading through your contracts before you sign them. That's okay if everything goes according to plan. It's only when things go wrong and the relationship between the two parties or more parties breaks down that the contents of your contract become extremely important. Football player employment contracts are drafted in line with the Football Association's regulations, which is adopted from the FIFA regulations and adapted in line with the national laws. Now let's take a look at the first section. So although I'm not doing this in any particular order, the first logical section of a contract is the parties. And that's because for whoever's reading it, they need to know who the parties are before they start reading through what the parties have agreed. So in our scenario, it would be the club, who is the employer, and the player, who is the employee. And it would read something like, this agreement has been made between TBD FC of 112 Ababanike Road, Enugu, hereinafter the club, and Chinedu Emmanuel Okoye of 24 Opiweka Street, Wane, Enugu, hereinafter the player. I made those details up, by the way. So hereinafter just means from this point onwards. So instead of having to keep repeating the names of the parties, they will just refer to them as the club and the player. This section would also have the name of the person who's going to sign on behalf of the club. So for instance, it could be the president who's representing the club. If there are any football agents that have been involved in the negotiations for either the club or for the player, then they should be named in this section as well. The second logical section of a contract is the definitions and interpretations. In this section, you get a definition of all the important words that will be used throughout the contract, and also an interpretation of any words that may be ambiguous, which means that they have more than one meaning. So for instance, in this section, you could get a definition for what a player's image is, what gross misconduct is, what permanent incapacity is, what a player agent is. You could get a definition of what the league is. You could get a definition of prohibited substance. It's very important for all the parties to fully understand what the terms of the contract are so that everybody is on the same page. The next section I'd like to discuss is the appointment and duration of the contract. This section lays out exactly what the employer has employed the employee to do. In our scenario, the club has employed the player to play football. The duration of the contract would depend on how old the player is at the time of engagement. So the FIFA regulations state that the minimum length of the contract is from the date of signing until the end of the season. If the player is an adult above the age of 18, then the maximum length of the contract is 5 years, unless the national laws of that country allow differently. And the maximum length of a contract for a player who is a minor under the age of 18 is 3 years. Any other agreement between the player and the club that states that the player can sign for longer is not accepted. So this next section I'm going to talk about contains the obligations of the player. This is basically where the club lays out everything they expect of the player whilst he's playing for the club. It's really important that the player fully understands what his obligations are, because a failure to abide by some of those obligations could lead to a breach of contract. This section would have things like the fact that the player needs to abide by the rules of the club, that he needs to abide by the laws of the game, the fact that he needs to attend training, he needs to participate in matches where he's not injured, and whilst he's participating in those games, he needs to play to the best of his skill and ability, that he needs to stay away from anything that's going to bring the name of the club into disrepute, bring negative press to the club, basically. It may include things like stay away from gambling, live a sportsman's lifestyle, so stay away from drugs, stay away from alcohol, make sure that you eat the right things, and you watch your weight. It really differs from club to club, so it's important that when you sign a new contract with a club, that you don't just assume that you know what's going to be in the obligations of a player section, and that you actually read through to know what that particular club expects of you. We've taken a look at the obligations of the player. In this section, we're going to be taking a look at the obligations of the club. So in this section, the club more or less lays out everything that they plan to do for the player during his employment with the club. This will include things like being provided with the rules of the game, being provided with medical examinations, dental examinations, being provided with health insurance, having their salaries paid on time. That's a really big one. And being allowed to go on international duty if they get a call up from the national team. If the player being employed is a minor, then the club is also obliged to provide them with an education, and this will be stipulated in this part of the contract. Again, this differs from club to club, so it's always good for you to have a read of this section and fully understand what the club is planning to do for you. So this next section is the remuneration section, and it's a section that excites people the most. And it's not just footballers, this is all walks of life. Everybody wants to know, what am I getting? What are my benefits? So for a footballer, this section will contain his salary, of course, and then it will have any sign-on fees that may have been agreed, any match bonuses. It will contain any allowances that he's been given for housing, for car, for flights. So let's say a return flight to and from home or to his chosen destination. It may also contain the deduction of any fines that may have been accrued by the player for maybe turning up late for training, for instance. The stronger your negotiating power, the better you can do in this section to beef it up. So the bigger the player you are, the more negotiating power you have to really fill this space up. This next section lays down the conditions under which either party may terminate the contract. So for a club, it's usually gross misconduct. It could also be that the player has been issued a final warning and they've done something else. Also, if the player has been convicted of a crime and is going to serve a custodial sentence, that means he's going to prison. The club may actually decide at that point to terminate his contract as well. For the player, it's usually where there's been a persistent breach of the terms and conditions of the contract by the club. And this is things like maybe delaying in salaries. I'm going to do a separate video which talks about terminating your contract with just cause, so please don't go terminating your contracts just yet. I'll also need to tell you that there is a mutual termination that could also be reached if both parties have decided that the love is lost. They could just decide to part ways amicably and just sign an agreement to say that this is what we've done and this is what compensation, either party is receiving. This next section is holidays or annual leave, something we all enjoy. So this will lay down the entitlements of the player in terms of annual leave. Obviously, because of the nature of the game, it's quite restrictive. It's not the same as a regular person, booking annual leave whenever they want through the year. It's quite restrictive, and it is at a certain period in the year, but it is what it is, and at least the player knows when it is, and if they want to make any plans, they know when to make the plans for. It's inevitable or unavoidable that from time to time, disputes will arise between the player and the club. This section lays down how the parties plan to resolve any disputes that may come up. If it's a domestic dispute, so between a player and a club who belong to the same member association, then this could potentially be looked at locally. Whereas the transnational nature of football raises the question of where would a player or a club go for some kind of relief if the player is from one member association and the club is from another. Thankfully, FIFA has a tribunal which has different competencies and is able to hear these cases and help resolve disputes. Another alternative is arbitration. Either way, it's important that you mention in the contract how you plan to resolve these disputes. For instance, if you're planning to use the Court of Arbitration for Sports and you don't mention this in the contract, it could actually mean that the CAS, Court of Arbitration for Sports, don't have jurisdiction and will be unable to hear this case. This next section is the force majeure section. A force majeure clause is a contractual clause which alters the liability of a party to perform under a contract where there's been an extraordinary event which is beyond that party's control. Examples are declaration of war, a disease epidemic, COVID springs to mind. It could be a volcano, it could be an earthquake, it could be a hurricane, or any other event which falls under the legal term of act of God. The final section I'd like to talk about is the signature section. Now, this is usually the last section on the contract. And this is the point where the parties are saying, we've had a look through the contract, we're happy with the terms, and we're happy to go into business together. This is usually where you'll see the handshaking pictures between the player and a representative from the club. You're probably wondering, why am I doing a section on signatures? Isn't it just signatures? However, there's some bits of advice I'd like to give players. The first one is, please always sign and date your contracts, even if there's already a date and your name printed on there already. So for instance, if you're presented with a contract and it already has your name and the 25th of February 2022 printed on it, and you're signing the contract on the 26th of February 2022, please write down that you're signing the contract on the 26th of February 2022. And I'm saying this based on experience I've had where it has actually mattered what date the player actually signed the contract, physically signed the contract. The second thing is, always initial every page of the contract where there is information. The third thing, always request a copy of the contract, the signed contract. It should be something that's done as a matter of course. You should be given a copy of the signed contract, but sometimes you may have to request it. Worst case scenario, on the day of signing, just make sure you take a picture of every single page on your phone and keep it safe. Some advice for club: please always deposit a copy of the contract with the member association. I have actually been involved in at least 5 disputes where the player is either accusing the club of tampering with the documentation, or the club is accusing the player of tampering with the documentation, and I am looking at both contracts which were meant to have been signed on the same day at the same time, but they've got different information in it, and I can't tell which one is the original and which one is the allegedly doctored one. But if this is submitted to the member association, then you can make a request for it. I've requested for it before and I've been told there wasn't one. So it's always important that you submit a copy of the contract to the member association to avoid issues like this. So finally, I come to the end of this video. I hope you found it useful and I hope it's not been too long for you. I do try and keep these videos short, but sometimes it's very difficult to do so without missing out some bits of information. If you've enjoyed it, then you can go and watch my video, What is a Contract?, which talks about the elements of a valid contract. As always, if you'd like to discuss anything in this video, then you can send me an email or you can connect with me on social media, and you can leave comments in the box below as well. Don't forget to subscribe and share.